who was in charge of an elite army battalion, had defected from the regime after there was news of the ICC sort of looking into things?
Well, there's two parts to that, Lauren. First of all, the standard of proof that the UN needs to refer to the ICC is quite low. They just have to get the ICC to look to see if they think there has perhaps been crimes against humanity, and from what he has seen on TV, he believes that that is the case. The second part, of course, is the warning that is issued to Muammar Gaddafi, to members of the regime and to others, which is putting them on watch, essentially saying, we know what is going on. You're in charge of your troops. Part of being in charge is responsibility, and if they are committing crimes, then you are responsible and we will come after you. But as I say, he's also making the point that the rebels who have weapons now, if they start carrying out anything on that sort of level, then they too will be subject to the investigation by the ICC.
OK, Alan Fisher, thank you very much indeed. Alan Fisher live in The Hague. There's growing pressure to intervene against Gaddafi on moral and humanitarian grounds, but it seems that the international community can't make up its mind about exactly what to do. One major fear seems to be that military intervention might simply provide a new home for people that they fear more than Gaddafi, Al-Qaeda. And Lawrence Lee reports.
Muammar Gaddafi says a lot of things, but he says one thing consistently. In every speech he's given since this crisis began, he's claimed the insurgency is being led by Al-Qaeda, and they're all over the country.
These dormant cells of Al-Qaeda, very few groups in Darna, others in Tobruk, others in Benghazi, a cell in AlJazeera, possibly, Misrata, certain operatives infiltrated from outside and settled in these areas.
Repeatedly, insurgents have denied this. Up until now, it also appears the outside world doesn't believe Gaddafi. After all, why would a country like Britain say it's prepared to consider arming the insurgency if they thought that it might contain Al-Qaeda elements?
I do think it's the job of leaders and the Western world in particular to prepare for all eventualities and all the things that might happen, particularly if Colonel Gaddafi unleashes more things on his own people.
Why would there still be a discussion in Washington about airstrikes or no-fly zones against Gaddafi if it helped Al-Qaeda come to power?
They do need the tools to prevent the slaughter of innocents on Libyan streets. And I believe that the global community cannot be on the sidelines while airplanes are allowed to bomb and strafe.
Here's the difficulty for the West, though. Even if Gaddafi's wrong, the West firmly believes Al-Qaeda does have a presence in several countries neighbouring Libya, or at least within striking distance. If the West helped to destabilise Libya, then it might undermine a growing sense of a secular Arab revolution, creating space for Al-Qaeda to exploit.
One of our biggest concerns is Libya descending into chaos and becoming a giant Somalia. It's right now not something that we see in the offing, but many of the Al-Qaeda activists in Afghanistan and later in Iraq came from Libya and came from eastern Libya, which is now the so-called free area of Libya. So, I mean, there is a lot of moving parts to this.
The worst mistake the West made in Iraq was trying to destabilize a regime and instead destabilizing a country. Perhaps the uncertainty about military intervention now suggests they've learned a lesson that undermining Al-Qaeda's aims may be best served by not getting involved. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera.
Well, the Arab League says it could impose a no-fly zone over Libya if fighting continues. The group's Secretary-General says this action could be taken in coordination with the African Union.
We'll continue consultations on the best way to protect and guarantee the safety and security of the Libyan people and that of the Arab nations. We will not remain idle in light of the bloodshed that the Libyan people are facing, and therefore we may resort to a no-fly zone, and the Arab League and African Union are cooperating in this regard.
The US Defence Secretary has urged caution over imposing a no-fly zone over Libya if the fighting does continue.
There's a lot of, frankly, loose talk about some of these military options, and let's just call a spade a spade. A no-fly zone begins with an attack on Libya to destroy the air defenses. That's the way you do a no-fly zone. And then you can fly planes around the country and not worry about our guys being shot down. But that's the way it starts.
I'm not endorsing it.
And
I'm
it
just
requires,
wondering.
no, I understand, but it also requires more airplanes than you would find on a single aircraft carrier. So it is a big operation in a big country.
Well, Dave Hartwell is a Middle East and North Africa analyst. He says suppressing Libyan air power could help rebel fighters on the ground, but it is easier said than done.
Well, a no-fly zone is essentially a mechanism that is imposed, if you like, from outside normally by Western nations. As if we look at the example in Iraq, the Kurdish no-fly zone in the north just after the 1991 Gulf War, that forces opposition aircraft to stay on the ground. It means that they can't launch operations against ground formations. They can't launch operations against protesters. So that essentially is a no-fly zone. But whether, I mean, we've heard various reservations expressed by the Americans, and Bob Gates was the most fervent in that it is not a small operation. He's right that you need to take out the air defences. You need to make the skies essentially safe for the opposition air forces to operate unimpeded. It may be seen as aiding the fighting in the sense that it will restrict Gaddafi's ability to launch airstrikes, but it won't. My guess is it won't put an end to the fighting, and indeed any attempt to sort of come in on the side of the opposition will be construed by Gaddafi, certainly and his supporters as the West, if you like, aiding the regime change. It won't be like the situation in northern Iraq, for example, where there was essentially a humanitarian operation, no-fly zone. This will be seen as something very, very different.
In 2004, 5 Bulgarian nurses were found guilty by a Libyan court of deliberately infecting hundreds of children at a Benghazi hospital with HIV. They spent years on death row before finally being freed and sent home in 2007. Sonia Gallego spoke to the nurses, who've always maintained their innocence, and say they'd been tortured into confessing.
It was an ordeal she will never forget. 3.5 years have passed since Valia Chervenyashka and 4 other Bulgarian nurses were released from a Libyan prison. All of them accused of deliberately infecting hundreds of children with HIV. A claim refuted by several foreign medical reports who said that poor hygiene and reused syringes were the most likely cause of the infection. But it took 8 years of legal wrangling and torture before they were allowed back to Bulgaria. Today, working as a pediatric nurse in a northern Bulgarian town, Valia Chervenyashka has put the torment behind her, but she still bears the scars of her time as a prisoner in Libya.
In the jail, the investigators began to question me about my mother's and father's names. Then they started to ask me about AIDS. I told them I didn't know any more than anybody else. And they said, "What do you mean you don't know? You don't know?" They put a pole behind my knees like that, my legs and my arms tied up like this, and they lifted me. I was hanging like an animal. And they started to beat me on my feet with a pipe. And again they asked, "What do you know about AIDS?"